In this peaceful spot by the River Brent in West London, St Mary's Perivale has stood for nearly 900 years. Surrounded by its peaceful churchyard, it has survived storms, wars, famines, plagues, and even developers. Acquired in 1976 by a charity set up for the purpose, it has now become one of the most important classical music venues in Britain. We're too small for orchestras, but our size and acoustics give us a perfect venue for chamber music and instrumental recitals. During the recent pandemic, we were not allowed to have a live audience, but we have not only survived but actually thrived by live streaming our concerts. Now, we are thrilled to be able to readmit an audience, but the live streams continue as an essential part of our offering. So, wherever you are, enjoy this concert. And please consider donating via our website. Thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon and welcome to St Mary's Perivale. Great to have you with us. Full church today for a lovely presentation by Christopher Kent, Sarah Sherborne and Gamal Khamis. They've given many presentations here before, and they're always superb. Today's is entitled An Exquisite Harmony, and it's about the lives, loves, and music of Robert and Clara Schumann and Johannes Brahms, all in about 1850, and you will find it absolutely fascinating, and they're terrific. So without more ado, I'm going to ask you all to put your hands together to give a big warm welcome. Thank you.
After midday, on a wet Monday in Dusseldorf, the 27th of February, 1854, a stooping middle-aged man emerged suddenly from a house on the Bilkerstrasse. He was pale and dishevelled, wearing only a thin dressing gown and carpet slippers. For days previously, he'd been complaining of tinnitus and debilitating auditory hallucinations, prominent amongst which was a single incessant concert A ringing in his ears. He turned down the cobbled street and shuffled off towards the nearby River Rhine. But when he reached the narrow pontoon bridge, finding he had no money for the toll, he smiled apologetically and gave his silk handkerchief to the gatekeeper. Then, before anyone could stop him, he rushed halfway across the bridge, paused briefly, and hurled himself into the icy torrent below. He might easily have been swept away, had it not been for a group of nearby boatmen who saw what was happening and came quickly to his rescue. As he was brought ashore, struggling and bedraggled, a bystander recognized him as Herr Dr. Robert Schumann, the celebrated composer and critic, and until recently conductor of the local Dusseldorf orchestra. Less than a week later, at Schumann's own insistence, he was transported to an asylum at Endenich near Bonn. He was to spend the rest of his life there. His children never saw him again, and his wife Clara, famous across Europe as a virtuoso concert pianist, was prevented from seeing him for 2.5 years until just before his death. The day before Robert's departure, a young composer friend of the Schumann family rushed from his position in Hanover to be with the distressed and grieving Clara. His name was Johannes Brahms. What happened next has long been the subject of speculation, but one way or another, their relationship was to last for the rest of both of their lives. In later life, Clara was to describe it to her children as an exquisite harmony of souls.
My dear, dear Robert, I call you dear with all my heart. How beautifully you wrote this time. Not mere words, but delicate flowers which you scattered about for me. The most beautiful laurels, they always come from you. This was a hard day for me, but beautiful. I gave my 4th concert this afternoon and there were 13 curtain calls. You probably won't understand the public's enthusiasm, since you don't know me well enough yet as an artist. But you will, my darling, you will.
The marriage between Robert and Clara Schumann is one of music's great love stories. But so too, in a different way, was her relationship with the much younger Johannes Brahms, which was to last for many more years, but is altogether less clear. And for 2 crucial years, those relationships overlapped. Because the 2 men became celebrated as composers, their legacy is preserved in music. But it's really Clara who was the true phenomenon of her age. And for most of her own lifetime, she was more famous than either of them. Concertgoers in early 19th century Germany were hungry for spectacle. Barnstorming virtuosi roamed the land, and this was truly the age of the Wunderkind, or child prodigy, and the pushy parents who sometimes saw them as their meal ticket. Clara's father, Friedrich Wieck, was the pushy parent beyond compare. A piano teacher, piano salesman, and concert impresario from Leipzig, who bred his youngest daughter for the concert platform from early childhood, regularly deducting a couple of years from her age to make sure she stood out from the crowd. Clara, quite literally, could play before she could speak. She didn't say a word till she was 4 years old and wasn't fluent in speech until she was 8, by which time her concert career was in full flight.
We heard the little Wieck of Leipzig. She's a veritable marvel. Perfect execution, irreproachable measure, force, clarity. She feels what she plays and knows how to express it.
It was especially pleasing to hear the young musically talented Clara Wieck, just 8 years old, perform. We may entertain the greatest hopes for this child who has trained under the direction of her father.
Even in her first piece, the artist, who is still so young, reaped thundering approval, and indeed the great skill, assurance and strength with which she plays is highly remarkable. One could scarcely wish for more.
And yet, in her case, there clearly was more. For one thing, her father's teaching methods were innovative and successful. And one of the things he insisted on was that his students should learn not just to play, but also to compose. Something Clara did from early childhood right through to her young adult years. The prejudices of the time and her own modesty meant that many of these pieces weren't taken seriously until more recently, but she always included them in her early concert programs. And many of them are now considered to be works of considerable significance, which are rightly finding their place at the heart of the concert repertoire. But it was no kind of a childhood. Friedrich was a fierce and often angry man. He divorced Clara's mother, but kept custody of her children, as was his right in those days. And on the rare occasions Clara was allowed to see her mother, his instructions were frighteningly specific. Madam, I am sending you the dearest thing in life still left to me. You will give the child little pastry and make sure you do not condone any naughtiness. When she practices, do not allow her to rush. I expect the most rigorous adherence to my wishes. If not, my anger will be incurred. Another thing that he insisted on was that she should keep a diary, a habit that was to stay with Clara through the rest of her life, though in these early entries it does sound as though he might have been dictating them himself.
My father observed again today that I am just as lazy, careless, disorderly, stubborn and disobedient as ever, and that I am the same in my piano playing and my studies. And because I played so badly, he tore up the music before my eyes, and from today he will not give me any more lessons, and I may not play anything but scales and trilling exercises.
Into this strange environment, when Clara was still only 12 years old, wandered a dreamy but eccentric and charming young student called Robert Schumann. He was supposed to be studying law at the university in Leipzig, but his true passions lay with literature and music. He was an accomplished, sometimes even dazzling pianist himself, and had begun to compose idiosyncratic repertoire to showcase his virtuosic skills. Hearing of Friedrich's advanced reputation as a teacher, he approached him and asked for lessons. And Friedrich, perhaps thinking he spied another money-making opportunity, agreed to take him on as a student, even after a couple of years, moving him into the house as a lodger. This, as he later came to realize, was a mistake. Because Clara, isolated and no doubt lonely, immediately lashed onto him, initially probably as an idolized older brother sort of figure, but increasingly as she grew into and beyond adolescence, something more than that. Clara had no experience of the world outside, something young Robert, 9 years her senior, was able to tell her a good deal about. He was a drinker and carouser with a good many romantic attachments already behind him. Friedrich undoubtedly grew suspicious, but he tolerated his presence largely because he could see that his compositions were something special. Robert's music wasn't like anyone else's. It's hard to imagine how these now familiar early solo works for piano, Kreisleriana, Papillon, Carnival, must have seemed at the time. Typically sequences or cycles of musical vignettes, peopled with characters from books he'd read or stories he'd imagined. Crucially, he began to introduce musical codes or ciphers, and perhaps prophetically, for someone who probably suffered from what we might now call bipolar disorder, he created recurring themes for what he saw as the two sides of his own personality: the shy and introverted Eusebius, and the fiery and outgoing Florestan. He even created a secret theme for Clara herself, a falling motif based on the musical notes of her own name, C-A-A, or sometimes C-A flat, A flat, and the notes between and around them. And this began to permeate his music more and more over the years that followed. It ranged from the bombastic to the contemplative. It even featured in the famous piano concerto he was to write for Clara. And the extended ecstatic love poem that was his C major fantasy. But Friedrich was right to be worried. Robert was a sweet-natured but wildly unpredictable personality, whose frequent frenetic bouts of activity were often followed by long troughs of despondency. At some point, he sustained a finger injury through the use of a curious finger-stretching device, or so he claimed. Clara later said he simply had a rheumatic condition. But Friedrich's reaction was immediate. He threw Robert out of his house and took Clara away on an extended concert tour of Europe. She was feted in Paris, Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna, where she was even given the title, aged only 18 at court, of royal and imperial virtuosa. But by now, the relationship was well underway, and when she returned home, the couple began to meet in secret. And then, just before her 20th birthday, they announced their intention to be married. Friedrich was outraged and tried everything he could to stop them, including spreading malicious, if not completely unfounded, rumors about Robert's mental instability and excessive drinking. But undeterred, the couple applied to the Court of Appeals for permission to marry without his consent, and after a protracted legal battle, the court ruled in their favor, and they were married the day before Clara's 21st birthday on the 12th of September, 1840. All this time, Robert had been working at a feverish pace, setting an absolute torrent of romantic love poetry by his favorite authors, Ruckert, Goethe, Heine, for voice and piano, and dedicating it all to Clara in what came to be known as the Year of Song in 1840. Among the collections was one he called Myrten, or Myrtles, after the flower traditionally given to a bride on her wedding day. And the first song in the collection was a rapturous setting of Friedrich Ruckert's poem Widmung, or dedication. You are my soul, You are my heart. You are my bliss. You are my pain. You're the heaven to which I soar. You're the world in which I live. You are the tomb within which my heart lies buried forever. Clara thought he should be pushing himself further.
I am often pained that Robert's compositions are not recognised as they deserve to be. I would play them gladly, but the public doesn't understand them. He has much too deep an intellect. I believe the best thing for him is to compose for orchestra. His fantasy is limited by the piano. His pieces are all in orchestral style, and I think that is why they are so inaccessible to the public. It takes a great deal to discover all their beauties. My greatest wish is that he compose for orchestra. That is his realm. If only I could succeed in persuading him.
But she did persuade him. A year of orchestral music followed in 1842. He worked at ferocious pace. 2 symphonies and a piano concerto, with the first Spring Symphony sketched in 4 days and orchestrated in 10. An extraordinary feat for someone with no formal training as a composer. Both Robert and Clara had kept diaries as individuals, but Robert now had a new idea: the marriage diary. My dearly beloved young wife, this little book that I'm starting today is to be a diary of all that concerns us in our domestic and married life, to be a record of our wishes and our hopes, and the means whereby we may convey to one another any requests we may have to make, and to be a mediator and reconciler should we chance to misjudge or misunderstand each other. Our diary is to be written up week by you and me alternately, and handed over every Sunday morning.
20th of September, 1840. I must confess to you, my dear husband, that I have never lived such happy days as those just past, and surely I am the happiest wife on earth. To me, it seems as though I love you more every minute, and I can truly say I only live through you. It is my greatest happiness when you are completely satisfied with me. And should something not be right for you, tell me so right away, really, my dear husband. Will you do that?
But even in these early entries, certain difficulties begin to emerge.
21st of December. We have started with the fugues of Bach. Robert marks those places where the theme always returns. But Robert reprimanded me very strongly. I had doubled one place in octaves, and thus impermissibly added a 5th voice to the 4th voice texture. He was right to denounce me for this, but it pained me not to have noticed it myself. I depend so much on his moods. It may not be good, perhaps, but I can't help myself.
In many ways, it was a practical solution. They both found it difficult to express themselves in speech, and the diary enabled them to articulate complaints, fears, and problems they might not otherwise have spoken out loud. But it doesn't always make for easy reading. One minute they're studying Goethe and Shakespeare together, the next the pressures of domestic life and professional rivalry come to the fore, including Robert's clear expectation that she would give up her playing career, and his insistence that her practice disturbed his composing.
20th of March, 1841. I don't get to play at all nowadays. Partly my being unwell prevents it, partly Robert's composing. If only it were possible to resolve the evil of the thin walls. I unlearn everything. For several days Robert has been very cold towards me. Yet this coldness sometimes hurts me who would least deserve it. Forgive me for this complaint, my dear Robert, but once in a while reason must give way to emotion. 2nd of June, 1841. My piano playing is falling behind. There is not even one little hour in the whole day for myself. And I can't do anything with my composing. I would sometimes like to strike my dumb head.
Clara's oblique reference to feeling unwell actually meant she was now pregnant. And to the couple's great delight, their first child, Marie, was born almost exactly a year after the wedding. Incredibly, over the next 12 years, Clara was to bear 7 more children. And there were at least 2 other unsuccessful pregnancies. She must have been almost constantly pregnant during this time, and Robert clearly seems to have hoped that motherhood would keep her firmly in the home. To have children and a husband who is always living in the realms of imagination do not go together with a public life. But Clara herself knows that her main occupation is as a mother, and I believe she is happy in the circumstances and would not want them changed. But he underestimated her determination. After all, she'd been brought up since early childhood to perform in public, and it's not something she was about to give up without a struggle. There were at least 15 concerts during the first 4 months of 1842 alone, when Marie was only a few months old. So how did she do it? Well, wet nurses and maids came cheap, and Clara also, as she was to do throughout her career, made use of an extended network of family and friends. Motherhood, though relished, was not going to tie her down.
I weighed the whole thing. I am a woman, am not neglecting anything, and can earn nothing at home. Why should I not use my talent to make my contribution? Can anyone blame me for this?
In fact, she could earn more in one 3-week concert tour than he could in an entire year. Everywhere she went, she was surrounded by acclaim and adulation. But Robert reacted badly. My dear Clara, do you still recognize this handwriting? Have you forgotten me already? Yesterday I could hardly bear the melancholy that overwhelmed me. This desolation in the house, this emptiness in me. Letting you go was one of the most foolish things I ever did in my life, and every day I have to listen to the most unkind judgments about it. A severe breakdown followed when she eventually arrived home, and the couple decided to move the family from Leipzig to Dresden. During the 5 years they spent there, Robert composed many of his most successful works. But the couple suffered a crushing bereavement when their longed-for first son and 4th child, Emile, died aged only 16 months. And Robert's mental health continued to deteriorate. When Clara discovered her 5th pregnancy in May 1847, there's a distinct change of tone in the diary.
What will become of my work? Yet Robert says children are blessings, and he is right, because without children there is indeed no happiness. And I have decided to face the difficult time that is coming as cheerfully as possible. Whether it will always be like this, I don't know.
Further pregnancies are described in the diary as Clara's new fears or frightening expectations. Then, in May 1849, there was a violent uprising in Dresden, right on their doorstep, and the family was in immediate danger. Robert, confused, sick, frightened, was in no position to know what to do, but Clara was made of sterner stuff. She tells this remarkable story in her diary.
Soon, we heard gunfire. A guard of safety formed itself in our street, and they wanted Robert to join. They threatened to search for him, but he and I escaped by the garden door. We had no time to take the children, who stayed in the house with their nurse. As we hurried through the city, we saw the terrible sight of dead bodies, men who had fallen the day before. We arrived in the country, but my anxiety was terrible, for our children were still in the city, and the thunder of the cannon was loud. In the evening, I decided to go back, but Robert could not come with me for fear of being press-ganged by the insurgents. I left by carriage and then on foot across the fields, arriving at our house in the dead of night. The children were still asleep. I tore them from their beds, dressed them, and we had just left again amidst the continuous thunder of the cannon, when suddenly we saw 40 men with scythes coming towards us. At first, I did not know what to do, but I plucked up courage, looked straight ahead, and we went quietly through.
It couldn't have been more different than the salons and concert halls of Europe. But it's clear that Dresden was neither a safe nor desirable place to continue living, and in 1850, Robert accepted an offer to become the music director of the Municipal Orchestra and Choral Society in Dusseldorf. It was a good position, but not one to which he was remotely suited. His difficulties with communicating and his inadequacies as a conductor quickly became a problem. Soon his musicians and employers were up in arms, and Robert sank back into gloom and despondency. In the midst of this fraught and difficult situation, one day there was a ring at the family's doorbell, which was answered by young Marie, now aged 12.
The bell rang toward noon. I ran out, as children do, and opened the door. And there I saw a very young man, handsome as a picture, with long blonde hair. He asked for my father. Father received him. The young man sat down at the piano. He had barely played a few measures of his own music when my father interrupted and ran out saying, "Please wait a minute, I must call my wife." He played to them all morning. There were such sounds, and the midday meal that followed was unforgettable. His name was Johannes Brahms.
arrived in their lives like a whirlwind. It's difficult to overestimate the effect he and his music had on them. They could speak or think of little else. In truth, they were both besotted. Clara wrote in her diary,
"This young man from Hamburg, just 20 years old, came as if sent straight from God. He played us sonatas and scherzos of his own, all of them showing exuberant imagination, feeling, and mastery of form. It is really moving to see him sitting at the piano with his interesting young face, which becomes transfigured when he plays, with perfect ease, these remarkable compositions. He came again the next day, and then the next week, each time bringing new works of his to play."
and Robert rushed into print. He is the one who should come, a young eagle, a mighty Niagara, the true apostle, a young blood by whose cradle graces and heroes kept watch. He who is called Johannes Brahms from Hamburg bore all the outward signs that proclaim to us, this is one of the elect. In truth, the young Brahms was probably overwhelmed by the attention. And in some ways, this very public proclamation of his genius was to have an inhibiting effect on him so early in his career. His first symphony, which was begun around this time in the early 1850s, wasn't completed till 1876. But there's no doubt he felt a deep sense of belonging in the Schumann household. And it's perhaps not surprising that he and Clara should have hit it off so quickly. Like her, he'd had a difficult childhood, and it seems that his itinerant musician father and much older mother had sent him out to work as a pianist in sleazy Hamburg nightclubs and brothels, even as quite a young teenager. He must have seen and heard things which were completely inappropriate for someone of his age. In later life, he alluded to experiences which left a deep shadow on his mind, and it undoubtedly affected his ability to form relationships. But he was a breath of fresh air in a difficult situation, because all was not well in the Schumann household. Robert had again been involved in an extreme bout of exhausting activity, which, as usual, was followed by destructive behavior and crippling depression. And his work with the Dusseldorf Orchestra had gone from bad to worse. Their concertmaster, Wilhelm von Wasilewski, wrote to complain to his board of trustees. Schumann has as little positive talent for conducting as he does for teaching music. He lacks the requisite ingredients for both, with no capacity to establish a close rapport with others, nor to make his intentions clear and obvious. This because he either says nothing or speaks so softly that he'd only barely be understood. Often Clara would sit in and assist him in rehearsals. It must have been a bit like having Lang Lang as a rehearsal pianist, trying to interpret his wishes to the players, but her loyalty and desire to protect him blinded her to the reality of the situation. She was increasingly incensed by what she saw as casual snubs to her husband and the assumption that she too would play, as she put it, for a basket of flowers. They were both crushed when Robert was summarily replaced as conductor by a younger candidate with commensurate reductions in salary. Despite all this, he continued to compose prolifically. Almost a third of his total compositional output came during the 4 years of his Dusseldorf tenure. But his doctors were becoming increasingly concerned about his erratic behavior. He'd begun to take an interest in spiritualism, and there were frequent mentions of suicide. Then, in February 1854, matters reached a head.
Last night, Robert suffered so violent an affection of the hearing that he did not close his eyes all night. He kept on hearing the same note over and over again. My poor Robert suffers terribly. Every noise, he says, sounds to him like music, a music more wonderful and played by more exquisite instruments than ever sounded on earth. He was firmly convinced that angels hovered round him, revealing glories to him. Robert said frequently that if this did not cease, his mind must give way. The doctor says he can do absolutely nothing. Morning came, and with it a terrible change. The angel voices turned to those of demons, and in hideous music they told him he was a sinner and they would cast him into hell. There were often moments when he begged me to leave him, as he might do me an injury. He often complained that his head was spinning and that it would soon be all over for him, and he would take leave of me. He was so melancholy that I cannot possibly describe it. When I merely touched him, he said,
Clara, I am not worthy of you.
He said that. He to whom I had always looked up with the greatest, deepest reverence.
Things were rapidly approaching a point of crisis, and Clara was at a complete loss. What could she do? To whom could she turn? As so often in her life, she sought consolation in music, and for the first time in years, she sat down to compose.
I once believed that I possessed creative talent, but a woman must not desire to compose. There has never yet been one able to do it. Should I expect to be that one?
Eventually, Robert made his fateful, if unsuccessful, suicide attempt. For days previously, as the situation deteriorated, Clara, now heavily pregnant with their 8th child, was advised to stay away from him for her own safety. Even the calamitous events in the chilly waters of the Rhine on the 27th of February had been kept from her. So she was devastated when she discovered that arrangements had already been made at Robert's own insistence for him to be transported to the asylum at Endenich, many hours coach travel away.
He, my glorious Robert, in an asylum. How was it possible for me to bear it? And I was forbidden to clasp him once more to my heart. I had to make this greatest of sacrifices for him, for my Robert. They took him. Oh God, the carriage stood at our door. Robert, dressed in great haste, got into the carriage with the doctor and 2 attendants, and did not ask for me or for his children. And I sat at my neighbour's house in a dull stupor, and I thought that now I must succumb. Brahms came over from Hanover today, and at once came to see me. He said he had only come to comfort me with music, if I had any wish for it. He is going to stay here for the present, and later, when Robert is so far recovered that he can see strangers, he will devote himself to him. What touching friendship.
Most of us have an image in our minds of Johannes Brahms as a corpulent, heavily bearded figure with a cigar firmly clamped between his teeth. But this is really only a persona he developed in his middle and later years. At the point at which he came to live in the Schumann household, he was still a very young man, handsome as a picture with long blonde hair, described by Marie Schumann when he first came to the family's door in 1850.
I see as though it was in a picture, we children standing in the hall of our house in Dusseldorf. With amazement and admiration, they are looking up at the banisters, on which a fair young man is performing the most daring gymnastics. He hoists himself from right to left and up and down, and at last he raises himself firmly on his arms, with his legs high in the air, and with a final leap lands him below in the midst of the admiring crowd of children. I and my elder brothers and sisters were the children, and the young man was Johannes Brahms.
Meanwhile, Robert was many hours away. The asylum at Endenich was a relatively benign environment by the standards of the time. He had his own room with a view of the mountains and access to a piano. But there was always the underlying threat that if the family didn't abide by the strictures of the institution, other treatments might have to be tried. Straitjackets, solitary confinement, and forced labor were all in common use at the time. And the one unbending rule of the institution was that at all costs agitation of the patient should be avoided, and this seems to have precluded visits from his own wife, although visits from other friends and family were sometimes allowed. It seems extraordinary that a woman of such strength of character as Clara should have agreed to have been bound by such conditions. After all, she was paying for his care, but in fact she didn't see him for more than 2.5 years. She wrote in her diary,
I cannot sleep at all, or just lie in a kind of half sleep, during which nothing but horrifying images hover over me. I constantly see and hear him. Oh, what agony it is for me. My heart breaks completely when I don't even know how he lives, what he does, whether he still hears the voices. And does he sleep? What does he do during the day? And does he ask for me or not?
but distressingly, the answer was not. He seems to have been in a state divorced from his previous existence, endlessly pacing back and forth and muttering to himself of mountains he had climbed or flowers he had picked.
If he thinks about flowers, why doesn't he think of me? Why doesn't he ask about me? Why doesn't he request news about me? Has he closed off his longing within himself? Then how terrible! What must he be suffering?
Her answer, as so often in her life, was to throw herself into her work. Her youngest child and fourth son, Felix, was born in June 1854. He was never to see his father. But by October, she was back on the road again, completing an exhaustive sequence of more than 20 concerts before the end of the year in Berlin, Frankfurt, Hanover, Leipzig and Ostend, and then the following year further afield to Prague, Budapest and Vienna. She refused all offers of financial assistance from friends and family and continued to earn money in the way that she knew best. Undoubtedly, it was also a way of dealing with her grief and surrounding herself by love and adulation. But all the time, she wrote continually to Endenich, but no response came. Until suddenly, blessedly, a single letter arrived from Robert in response to one she had written, timed to coincide with their wedding anniversary and her birthday. How I rejoiced, beloved Clara, to see your handwriting. High thanks for having written to me on such a day, and that you and the dear children still remember me. Greet and kiss the little ones. Oh, if I could see you and speak to you again. But the way is too far. So much I should like to know. How your life is going on, where you are living, and if you still play as gloriously as formerly. Oh, how I would love to hear your glorious playing just once. But what joyful news you have again sent me, that Brahms, to whom you will give my kind and admiring greeting, has come to live with you in Dusseldorf. What friendship! At other times, when he may have wondered why he hadn't heard from her, it turned out that the doctors were withholding her letters from him, again on the assumption that they might cause agitation. In truth, she doesn't seem to have pushed the matter or tried very hard to see him. Perhaps she was still in denial that her father's worst predictions had come true. Instead, she relied on news from other friends and family, including Brahms, who both visited and corresponded with Robert on a number of occasions. And it was a letter to her from Brahms in April 1856 which brought distressing news. It seems that matters had taken a turn for the worse. We sat down. It became increasingly painful for me. His eyes were moist. He spoke continuously, but I understood nothing. Often he just blabbered, sort of babada-dadada, while looking into the distance. When I questioned him at length, I understood the names Marie, Berlin, Vienna, England, not much more. The doctors say his brain is decidedly exhausted. He will remain at best in this significantly apathetic state. In 1 or 2 months, only supportive care will probably be necessary. Perhaps in protest against his continuing confinement, Robert had begun to withdraw from eating. The remaining medical records suggest he was probably tube-fed forcibly against his will. Meanwhile, Clara had embarked on her first tour of England. But when the worsening news reached her, she broke off, returned to Germany, travelled to Endenich, and for the first and only time during the 2.5 years of his confinement, insisted on seeing her husband.
He smiled at me and embraced me with great effort because he could no longer control his limbs. Never will I forget it. I wouldn't exchange that embrace for all the world's treasures. My Robert, that's how we had to meet again. With what effort I had to search for your beloved expressions. What a picture of pain. Only now and then I received a look clouded, as it were, but unspeakably gentle. Just once I heard him say,
My...
Surely he wanted to say, my Clara, because he looked at me in a friendly way, and then once again,
I know.
And I felt he wished to say you. I tried to feed him, and he accepted some little wine and jellied consommé. Ah, he knew that it was me.
Robert died at 4 p.m. the next day, the 29th of July, 1856, just as Clara and Brahms had slipped out to collect a friend from the newly opened railway.
I saw him only half an hour later. His head was beautiful, the forehead so transparent. I stood by his body, my ardently beloved husband, and was quiet. All my thoughts went up to God, that he is finally free. And as I knelt at his bed, it seemed as if a magnificent spirit was hovering over me. I laid some flowers on his head. God, give me strength. If only he had taken me with him.
According to the medical staff at the asylum, Robert continued to write music throughout his stay there. And yet almost none of it survives. And the assumption is that Clara and Brahms probably destroyed it, considering it to show signs of his mental decline, which perhaps it did. So almost the last completed work we have of his is the strange piece he wrote in the final throes of his mental illness, in the last days before he was committed to Endenich in 1854. It's come to be known as the Ghost Variations because he said that he'd been visited in a dream by the spirit of Franz Schubert, who dictated a beautiful melody to him which he'd managed to write down. It was indeed a beautiful melody, but he doesn't seem to have realized it's something he'd already written himself and included as the slow movement of his as yet unpublished violin concerto. During the feverish days that followed, he sat down and composed a sequence of variations on the theme. And it was after completing the fifth turbulent variation that he threw down his pen and rushed out to the River Rhine. Almost the last thing he did was dedicate the work to Clara, but she never played it. And again, she and Brahms tried to suppress the score. Listened to through 19th century years, it's not difficult to see how they might have thought of it as showing signs of mental confusion. As the variations progress, a strangely chromatic line worms its way between the otherwise recognizable Schumannesque outer voices, almost atonal in its effect. To them, it must have sounded demented. To us, from our later perspective, do we perhaps hear a strange foreshadowing of the atonal experimental music that followed in the 20th century afterwards? Or is it simply the sound of a mind adrift, struggling and longing to find its way home? Throughout the period of Robert's confinement in Endenich, the young Johannes Brahms had been living in the Schumann household, occupying what's sometimes described as a separate apartment and sometimes just an upstairs room. It's clear from his letters at this time that he developed a deep affection for Clara, perhaps even a crush or infatuation. He wrote in a letter to a friend, "I often have to restrain myself forcibly from just quietly putting my arm around her, and even, well, I don't know, it seems to me so natural that she could not misunderstand. I think I can no longer love an unmarried girl. At least I've quite forgotten about them. They but promise heaven while Clara shows it revealed to us." Her entries in her own diary also show affection, but perhaps in a slightly different way.
It is with Brahms that I prefer to talk about Robert. First, because Robert loves him more than anyone, and then because with all his youthfulness, he has such a soothingly tender feeling for me. The whole man is such a remarkable phenomenon, partly advanced far beyond his years, and partly always so childlike in his reactions. There is the most complete accord between us. It is not his youth that attracts me, nor perhaps my flattered vanity. No, it is his fresh mind, his gloriously gifted nature, and his noble heart that I love in him.
But he was barely more than 20. And she was 14 years his senior, and the mother now of 7 surviving children. And whatever her feelings may have been, there was also a practical aspect to it. Endenich was expensive, and she needed money to pay for it, which she could do handsomely as a celebrated concert artist, but only if the children and household were looked after. Robert kept detailed financial records, and for all his difficulties ran a tight financial ship. Brahms now took over the management of the household and childcare, supervising the children and domestic matters, and seems to have made a remarkably successful job of it, which is all the more surprising, considering his relative age and inexperience. Meanwhile, he continued to teach and mentor Clara's children, developing a deep bond with them. He took on students of his own and continued to compose, but he became increasingly specific in his communications to Clara while she was away on her concert tours. Here he is in 1855. "Clara, dear Clara, I feel ever more happy and peaceful in my love for you. Every time I miss you more, but I long for you almost with joy. That is how it is. And I knew the feeling already, but never quite so warm as it is now. I can do nothing but think of you. What have you done to me? Can't you remove the spell you have cast over me? I wish I could write to you as tenderly as I love you and tell you all the good things that I wish you. You are so infinitely dear to me, dearer than I can say. I should like to spend the whole day calling you endearing names and paying you compliments without ever being satisfied." But this is where it starts to get unclear, because we don't know what Clara may have written in response. Marie Schumann, who later became custodian of the family's history along with her younger sister Eugenie, explains that in later life, the two friends, conscious of the speculations surrounding their relationship, agreed to return their letters to each other. She says that Brahms claimed immediately to have thrown all his in the River Rhine, though enough of them survived to suggest that can't be completely the case. Whereas she says her mother began systematically to destroy her own letters until she was prevailed upon by her daughters to stop, which is why, by strange coincidence, although the later letters survive, there is nothing from this important period between 1854 and 1856. It's the same story with Clara's diaries. Marie says that she gave them to her mother's official biographer, Bertolt Litzmann, not long after her death. But he only included about a third of them. And again, it's assumed that Marie must have destroyed the rest. Which is why we have nothing at this pivotal moment in 1856. So long as Robert was alive, there could have been no possibility of considering any long-term future between Clara and Brahms. But thereafter, it might have seemed feasible. What we do know is that not long after Robert's death, on the 29th of July, 1856, the couple set out on a 4-week walking holiday of Switzerland. They weren't completely alone. They had with them Clara's two boys, Ferdinand and Ludwig, then aged 8 and 7, and Brahms's sister Lisa, presumably as chaperone. But there would have been plenty of time to talk. And yet Litzmann includes nothing from the diaries for this entire period, until they eventually arrived home, at which point it seems Brahms quite suddenly left the Schumann household for good and returned home to Hamburg, at which point Litzmann quotes just a single plaintive line from Clara's diary.
Johannes left. I went to the station with him. As I returned, I felt as if I were coming back from a funeral.
It seems clear that some kind of decision about the future had been reached. But the only other thing we have from around this time is a strange stray letter of Brahms which seems to allude to some kind of disagreement between them. Throughout the period that Brahms lived in the Schumann household, Clara had allowed them to be on first-name terms, and they'd addressed each other using the informal du pronoun rather than the more formal sie, as in French with tu and vous. It was highly unusual for the times, especially given their age difference, and it was commented upon. But at some point in the correspondence around this time, it seems that Brahms had reverted to addressing her formally as sie, and it must have upset her because he then writes in this letter, "My idea was that I should not avail myself again of your kindness and love, as you might regret it later on. That is why I resumed writing to you in a formal way. I take it then that all these tactics of siege and assault had some connection with the unanswered question. Or is that not so?" So, what was the unanswered question? And who asked it? Could it have been a proposal of marriage? We'll never know. But it's clear that Clara was deeply hurt by his abrupt departure and subsequent coldness to her. Her daughter Eugenie later wrote,
It was perhaps inevitable that he should recognise that the destiny he had to fulfil was irreconcilable with single-minded devotion to a friendship. That he broke away so ruthlessly was perhaps an inevitable consequence. But he never got over the self-reproach of having wounded my mother's feelings at the time, and my mother suffered all the more because she could not understand the change in him. She could admire the ruggedness in his compositions, but when the ruggedness of his nature came out in his manner to her, it hurt her deeply. But she remained towards Brahms what she had always been. She loved him truly and wholeheartedly.
There's just one final coda, perhaps the last flickering of a flame, in a letter from Clara to Brahms 2 years later in 1858, after what seems to have been a long silence from him.
I am waiting for another letter, my Johannes. If only I could find longing as sweet as you do. It only gives me pain and fills my heart with unspeakable woe. Write to me as often as you can. One requires to be cheerful during a cure, and whence would good cheer come to me, if not from you? Farewell. Think kindly of your Clara.
They were never to spend so much time in each other's company again. But somehow the friendship continued through the years. They saw each other occasionally and corresponded frequently, often about musical and financial matters. It seems that Clara was more successful with Brahms's growing investments than his own financial advisors. But it's the children that were her unbending focus and all-consuming preoccupation. As the single parent of a large family, she continued to earn money in the way she knew best, using her undoubted star power and box office draw. But it wasn't easy. She made all the arrangements herself, seeking, procuring, booking, and sometimes cancelling concerts, often at the last moment. And her diaries and letters are full of the minutiae of concert administration and travel arrangements. As the children grew older, Marie Schumann, who never married, became her travel companion and concert secretary, while the rest of the children were packed off to boarding schools or lodged with the extended network of family and friends, while Clara conducted her parenting by correspondence until the whole family came together for 2 blissful months each summer. Agonizingly, 4 of her children predeceased her, and one, Ludwig, in an unbearable echo of Robert's fate, was committed to an asylum aged 21 and spent the rest of his life there. And it wasn't just her own children she felt responsibility for. When her middle son Ferdinand died of tuberculosis, aged 42, she took on pastoral and financial responsibility for his 6 children as well. The resulting unbending work ethic seems to have been at the root of some of her later disagreements with Brahms. Here he is writing to her in his typically bluff North German fashion in 1861. "I should like to implore you to bear in mind that your unsettled way of living must come to an end in time. If only I could hear from you that you've formed a firm resolve to work no more than you're obliged to. That is to say, give no more concerts than you absolutely must in order to make both ends meet. You surely have enough money. It'd be far more reasonable and better on your part if you were to spare not only your beautiful self, but also your health." But her replies were forthright and immediate.
You think, dear Johannes, that because I occasionally lay something aside, I am giving too many concerts. But think of my responsibilities. 7 children still dependent on me, 5 who have yet to be educated, and this summer I shall have them all at home again. I am so depressed by 1,001 worries connected to my children. It is really too much for a woman alone to have to endure the burden of care without a man to help her. I am particularly at a loss to know what to do with my boys. Ludwig cannot be sent to any ordinary school.
What Eugenie referred to as Brahms's ruggedness was periodically to cause rifts and disagreements in the relationship, but they were always eventually resolved, usually when Brahms apologized, and the friendship continued undimmed through the years. Clara's daughters, ever protective of their beloved mama, were not always so immediately forgiving, and this was the context in which she wrote to them in later years.
You hardly knew your dear father. You were still too young to feel deep grief, and thus in those terrible years you could give me no comfort. Then came Johannes Brahms, like a true friend, to share all my sorrow. He strengthened the heart that threatened to break. He uplifted my mind. He cheered my spirit when and wherever he could. In short, he was my friend in the fullest sense of the word. I can truly say, my children, that I never loved any friend as I did him. It was an exquisite harmony of souls.
Gradually through the years, Brahms's fame, fortune, and career burgeoned. As the choral works, chamber music, concertos, and yes, eventually symphonies began to flow. But he always sent or brought his music for Clara to play through first, until in her later years, when her arthritis had finally got the better of her and she was no longer able to play in public, he began to send her an extraordinary sequence of shorter solo piano works, called things like Fantasy and Intermezzo, often with sparer textures and sometimes less technically demanding, perhaps in recognition of her diminishing powers, with just occasional passages of bravura so as perhaps not to tire her too much. They're full of musical instructions like teneramente, tenderly, and espressivo, expressively, and make use of the descending Clara themes so beloved of Robert, Clara, and Brahms himself, often reduced to the merest sigh. Clara called them her treasures. Were they perhaps a final love letter to her, a summation of feelings hitherto unexpressed and unconsummated? His last visit to Clara came in October 1895, when she was 76 and now living in Frankfurt. He stayed overnight, and then, Eugenie writes,
"The next morning, I heard Mama play some Bach, then Brahms's new intermezzo in E-flat minor. A little while after she had finished, I went in. Mama was sitting sideways at her writing table. Her cheeks were gently flushed, and her eyes shone as though illumined by a light from within. Brahms, who was sitting opposite her, was evidently touched with deep emotion. He said,
'Your mother has been playing most beautifully to me.' It was to be their last meeting. Eugenie continues.
A few hours later, Brahms said goodbye. The two friends embraced and kissed as they had done for years at every meeting and parting. Shortly afterwards, my mother fell ill, and in May of the following year, she was taken from us. The last time I saw Brahms, he was standing by her grave.
Brahms died himself less than a year later. He never married or had any long-term relationship with anyone else. His love for Clara at an early age had been all-consuming. She was perhaps an ideal that no one else could match. In many ways, she was also his constant inspiration. He once wrote, "By rights it should say on the title page of everything I've written, really by Clara Schumann." In many ways, he was unknowable. The big beard he grew in later life and the awkwardness of his manners were perhaps a way of distancing himself. Eugenie says that although her mother was often hurt by him, she knew it was never deliberate.
He never wanted to appear other than he was. The few faults he had were very much in evidence. He took no trouble to draw aside the slight veil they formed, and left it to others to lift it from the heart of pure gold, which was hidden underneath.
Clara continued to play in public as long as she was able, and during the course of her long career, she knew almost everyone of musical note. The Mendelssohns, Chopin, Berlioz, Liszt, Wagner. In her day, she was as famous as anyone in Europe, and much of what she did informs the way we now expect to listen to music. She believed in playing exactly what was written, with no embellishments, and believed the composer's intentions were sacrosanct, a novel idea in an age of freewheeling virtuosi. But because her career predated the age of recording, we have no real idea of what she sounded like, apart from this tantalizing memory of Eugenie's, of her mother practicing when they were children.
Directly after breakfast, the grand piano would be opened and the house flooded with sound. Scales rolled and swelled like a tidal wave, legato and staccato, in octaves, thirds, sixths, tenths, and double thirds. Then arpeggios of all kinds, everything prestissimo and without the slightest break, exquisite modulations leading from key to key. The most wonderful feature of this practicing was that it was new every day and seemed drawn ever fresh from a mysterious wellspring. They say that Paganini could make people weep with the playing of a scale, but so too could Mama. This inexpressible joy continued to the day when we heard it for the last time. She penetrated so deeply into the spirit of each work she played that they became almost part of her. They lay enshrined in her soul, and when she drew them forth, they seemed to have been newly created.
Clara continued to champion Robert's music throughout her life, and Brahms's too, premiering and programming almost everything he wrote for solo piano as long as she was able. But at the very end, as she lay on her deathbed and her grandson Ferdinand asked if he should play to her, it was Robert's music she asked for. Her love for him was undimmed to the end. By now, much of what he had written had become celebrated, but there were other things that lay undiscovered until long after both of their deaths. Perhaps they were just too painful, too personal to share with anyone else. And perhaps in the end, that exquisite harmony of which she wrote lay between three souls whose lives and music remain inextricably interwoven forever. Just before she died, Brahms wrote to a friend, "We must no longer be frightened of losing her. Not even me, the lonely one, for whom all too little remains in this world. But after she has left us, will not our faces shine when we think of her? That glorious woman whom it has been our pleasure to know through the course of a long life, loving and admiring her ever more and more. Thus, and thus only shall we mourn her.
Well, what an impressive performance that was, and of such an absorbing, fascinating, though sad story. And I think also the selection of music to accompany it was really, really appropriate. A wonderful performance all round, and how lucky we are too that because of all the sophisticated equipment that we have installed in the church, we can go home, we can re-watch it again whenever we wish on the St. Mary's Perivale YouTube channel. So thank you very much, Christopher, Sarah and Gamal, for a magnificent performance. Let's give them all another round of applause. And so, in concluding this special day, it just remains for me to thank you all for coming. It's really good to see the church essentially completely full. We normally have a good crowd for most of our concerts, but today was clearly very special. And I think many of you are new to the church or come very infrequently. If you'd like to be on Hugh's email address, then please leave your contact details with Sherry at the back. But also, please leave some good money behind. We need to maintain this building, which is about 850 years old. And of course, we need to pay the performers as well. So thank you very much for that. At the back, there is a sheet of our November concerts. We have 12 concerts, or 12 events that take place here. The next one is on Tuesday, in, 2 days' time, and that'll be the piano duo of Viv McLean and Tim Horton. And they will be playing Ravel's Mother Goose Suite, Schubert's Fantasia, and Brahms' Hungarian Dances number 2 and 5. So if you're into piano music, come along on Tuesdays. Come along on every Tuesday at 2 o'clock. I think the only thing left for me to say is to thank the technical team today. Simon Shute at the back there in the studio, and also Rob Jenkins, who's been doing the recording upstairs. And to thank also Sherry White at the box office. Thank you all for coming. Come again. And I think another round of applause is worthy of it. Thank you. Have a good evening.